Evan Hale had never been good at pretending everything was fine, but he had become excellent at staying quiet about it. By the time Michael told him that an old college friend would be visiting for a few days, Evan had already grown used to their marriage functioning on autopilot, steady, polite, and painfully distant. He didn't argue when Michael mentioned the visit, he simply nodded, hiding the small knot of unease tightening behind his ribs. It wasn't Adrian Cole that bothered him. It was the reminder that Michael could still manage warmth and enthusiasm, just not with him. When the doorbell rang late that evening, Evan was the one who answered. Michael was still pacing upstairs with his laptop, muttering about deadlines. Evan wiped his hands on the kitchen towel before opening the door, preparing a neutral smile. But the man standing on the porch shattered that composure instantly. Adrian had an easy posture, shoulders relaxed despite the exhaustion written across his face. His eyes, soft and steady, carried the kind of warmth that made Evan feel instantly visible. He held only one suitcase and a travel-worn jacket slung over his arm, but something about him seemed grounded, composed, impossible to ignore. "You must be Evan," Adrian said. His voice was calm, warm in a way that felt undeservedly comforting. "Yes. Come in," Evan replied, surprised by the slight tremor in his own voice. As Adrian stepped inside, a faint scent of rain clung to him, fresh, clean, strangely familiar. He looked around the living room with an appreciative smile, and for a moment Evan felt the house itself soften under the weight of his presence. Michael finally thundered down the stairs. His greeting to Adrian was friendly but hurried, almost perfunctory. After a brief embrace, he disappeared again, tossing over his shoulder that he needed to finish a report before morning. Evan saw the flicker of disappointment in Adrian's expression, brief but unmistakable, before the man masked it with a polite nod. "I'm sorry about that," Evan said quietly as he led Adrian toward the guest room. "He's been drowning in work lately." "No need to apologize," Adrian replied. "I'm just grateful he offered to host me." But his tone suggested he had expected something different, something more. Evan didn't pry. Instead, he opened the door to the guest room and flicked on the light. Adrian stepped inside and paused. The room was neat, freshly made, but drafty. Both men felt the cold instantly. Evan crossed the room to check the vent and frowned when nothing but a thin wisp of cold air seeped through. "This room always has temperature issues," Evan explained. "I thought the maintenance guy fixed it, but clearly not." Adrian rubbed his hands together, exhaling a thin laugh. "Looks like I'll be sleeping in a freezer." Evan smiled despite himself. "I'll bring extra blankets. Hopefully it won't be too bad." Adrian thanked him with a sincere nod. For reasons Evan couldn't pinpoint, the gratitude felt heavier than the situation required, as though Adrian wasn't talking about blankets at all. When Evan left him to settle in, he carried that strange impression with him. Back in the kitchen, Evan found Michael rummaging through the fridge with the distracted energy of someone half present. Without looking up, Michael said, "I hope everything's fine." "Adrian's not expecting much." "He's here to see you," Evan answered, keeping his tone gentle. "You could try being more present." Michael stiffened slightly. "I'm doing my best. It's just bad timing." "It's always bad timing lately," Evan said before he could stop himself. Michael shut the fridge quietly. "We can talk later." But they both knew they wouldn't. After Michael retreated upstairs again, the house settled into a stillness that made Evan uneasy. He caught himself glancing toward the hallway leading to the guest room, wondering why Adrian's presence felt so heavy in his mind. It wasn't attraction, at least not in any conscious sense. It was recognition, the kind that happens when a stranger walks in and somehow fits into the spaces you didn't realize had gone empty. Later, when Evan brought Adrian the promised blankets, he found him standing by the window. The moonlight outlined his silhouette, and he looked peaceful, almost contemplative. "Here," Evan said, handing him the stack of blankets. Adrian took them with a grateful smile. "Thank you. And, for the hospitality. I know it wasn't your idea to host a guest on short notice." "You're not a problem," Evan said. Then, surprising himself, he added, "Actually, it's nice having someone here." The words felt more honest than he intended. Adrian's eyes softened, and he said nothing for a moment. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but strangely revealing. Eventually, he replied, "If there's anything I can do to help while I'm here, let me know." Evan nodded, retreating before the moment became too noticeable. The night wore on quietly. The house clicked and hummed in its usual patterns, but Evan found himself unusually alert, lying awake in bed and listening to every small sound. His thoughts drifted to the guest room, to the cold vent, to the man trying to sleep under layers of blankets. He wondered if Adrian was also lying awake, thinking about the distance in the Hale household that he'd walked into. Unable to rest, Evan got up to grab a glass of water. As he passed the guest room, he heard a faint rustle inside. He hesitated, then forced himself to keep walking. The boundaries needed to remain intact. Yet he couldn't shake the sensation that the house felt different tonight, as if someone had arrived who saw more than either he or Michael intended to show. As he crawled back under his blankets, Evan tried to dismiss the thought. Adrian was just a guest. Just a friend of Michael's. Nothing more, but the truth pressed against him with quiet persistence. Adrian had been in the house for less than 3 hours, and Evan had already felt more noticed, more understood, than he had in months. He didn't know what that meant yet. He only knew that something had shifted, quietly but undeniably. When he finally started to doze off, one thought followed him into sleep: this visit would change something, he just didn't know what. Evan woke early the next morning, the pale light of dawn spilling across the bedroom floor. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator. He stretched, hoping for a few more moments of solitude, but his attention was already drifting to the guest room. Adrian had slept there all night, and though Evan had resisted imagining what that might mean, he couldn't help but wonder how the man had fared in the cold, drafty space. Downstairs, he found Adrian in the kitchen, standing by the counter as though he had been there for hours. The man was methodical, quietly pouring coffee into 2 mugs, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals. Evan froze for a moment, struck by how natural Adrian seemed in his home, how easily he inhabited the space. "Good morning," Evan said softly, trying to sound casual. "Morning," Adrian replied, his tone calm, warm, and disarmingly sincere. He handed Evan a mug. "Thought you might want one before the rest of the house wakes up." Evan accepted it, feeling an unusual tug in his chest. He lingered by the counter, aware of the subtle comfort in Adrian's presence, a comfort he hadn't realized he had been craving. The small domestic act, making coffee, noticing Evan, offering it, felt more intimate than any conversation he had had with Michael in months. "I hope you slept okay," Evan said, attempting small talk but finding it harder than he expected. Adrian gave a small smile. "The room was colder than I anticipated. But I managed. Blankets help. Thank you for those." Evan nodded, wishing he had offered them sooner. There was a quiet honesty in Adrian's tone, an understated vulnerability that drew him in. They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, the quiet of the morning giving them space to notice the small things, the way Adrian's eyes lingered on the kitchen window, or the subtle furrow in Evan's brow as he watched him. There was no rush, no performance, just presence. Eventually, Michael appeared, half-dressed in a suit jacket, his tie loose. He glanced at Adrian and smiled faintly. "Morning," he said, then returned immediately to his phone. Evan's chest tightened. Michael's attention had already evaporated, and the tension between presence and absence, so familiar, was back with a weighty insistence. Adrian looked toward Michael, then back at Evan. "He's busy," he said gently, the subtle acknowledgement making Evan's stomach flutter in an unfamiliar way. "It's okay," Evan replied, forcing a neutral tone. "He's often like that." Adrian nodded, as if understanding something he wasn't supposed to. Evan felt exposed, as though the man could read between the carefully constructed layers of his life. He realized he hadn't felt this scene in months, maybe years. The day unfolded slowly. Adrian offered to help with minor chores, tidying up the living room and organizing the kitchen shelves. It was a small kindness, but Evan noticed how effortless his actions were, and how much more attention he paid to details Evan usually ignored. The contrast with Michael, who was preoccupied and distracted, was painfully clear. By late afternoon, the first tension of the visit had begun to shift. Evan found himself laughing at Adrian's dry humor, the kind of laugh that crept up quietly and lingered. Adrian had a way of noticing the small ironies of life, the unspoken frustrations, and he did so without judgment. Evan felt a growing ease, the kind that made him forget the careful distance he normally maintained. "Do you always live like this?" Adrian asked at one point, tilting his head as he stacked a few dishes. "Quiet, tidy, but distant." Evan hesitated. "I suppose it depends on what you mean." "Life happens, I guess. Routine. Responsibilities. Sometimes it's easier to just keep moving rather than ask why you're lonely." Adrian nodded, as if confirming an unspoken truth. "I understand. More than you might think." There was a pause, a moment where neither needed to speak. Evan felt the air charged, not with danger, but with a rare emotional recognition. Someone was acknowledging his inner life, not judging it, not trying to fix it, just noticing. Later, Evan overheard Michael on a phone call. He was whispering, quick and terse, anger hidden behind polite words. Evan froze outside the study door, heart thudding, caught between curiosity and loyalty. Michael ended the call abruptly when he noticed Evan lingering. The sudden shift, the tension, and the secrecy made Evan's chest tighten further. Something was brewing in the house, and he wasn't sure what it was, but he felt the subtle threat of change creeping closer. That evening, the issue of the guest room returned. Adrian had attempted to settle in again, but the cold and draft were relentless. Evan, noticing Adrian shivering under a thin blanket, hesitated before speaking. "You don't have to stay there tonight," he said softly. "If it's too cold, you can stay here. Just for the night." Adrian paused, considering the offer. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something that made Evan's pulse quicken. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Evan said, almost too quickly. "I'll make sure it's comfortable. You won't be in the way." Adrian's eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude passing over his expression. "Thank you," he said. And with that, he followed Evan upstairs, the quiet shift of proximity charged with more than just practical necessity. Evan led him to his room, careful to maintain boundaries, but feeling the tension of closeness stretch taut between them. Adrian's movements were deliberate, unassuming, and respectful. Still, Evan couldn't deny the nervous anticipation crawling under his skin. There was no misstep, no breach, only the weight of presence and the quiet understanding that had been missing from his life. When Adrian settled onto the bed, still fully clothed, Evan stepped back. He could feel the significance of the moment without labeling it. It was not about desire, it was about recognition, the sudden intrusion of honesty into a household that had long been running on routines and half-truths. Evan lingered at the door, watching the man who had appeared as a simple guest now feel like something more, a mirror to the emptiness he had been avoiding. He felt the tension of choices yet to be made, the moral conflict stirring quietly but insistently. As he left the room, closing the door gently, Evan realized he would not sleep easily that night. His thoughts returned again and again to Adrian, his quiet strength, his warmth, the ease with which he seemed to notice Evan's life, his heart, and the spaces in between. Evan slid under his own covers, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustle from the guest room. The house felt different, changed by Adrian's presence. The night stretched long, and Evan understood, with a sudden, sober clarity, that something important had begun, something that could not be undone, and would demand choices he had long avoided making. By the time he drifted towards sleep, he was acutely aware of the shift in the house and within himself. This visit was no longer just a courtesy, a duty, or a favor for Michael. It had become the start of a subtle, delicate tension that promised both understanding and disruption. And Evan knew, deep down, that by morning, nothing would feel quite the same again. The night was still, the house wrapped in silence except for the occasional hum of the heater. Evan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Adrian. The man's presence in the house had shifted something in him, something that had long been dormant, quietly aching beneath the routines of a comfortable but distant marriage. He could hear the faint rustle of movement in the guest room, the soft sound of blankets adjusting, and he felt an odd combination of concern and curiosity. It wasn't about attraction in the way people usually thought, it was the awareness of someone noticing, someone present, someone genuinely attentive. Eventually, he could no longer remain under the covers. Slipping quietly from his room, he found Adrian sitting on the edge of the bed in the guest room, wrapped loosely in the blankets he had brought down. The man's posture was relaxed but slightly tense, as if he was aware of boundaries yet testing them silently. Couldn't sleep either? Evan asked softly, stepping into the room. Adrian looked up and smiled faintly. No. The room's cold, but, more than that, maybe. His eyes lingered on Evan in a way that made the air between them feel charged. It's strange being here. I feel a bit too aware of everything. Evan nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. I get that. Sometimes, when someone new comes in, it makes you notice the things you've been avoiding. Adrian's gaze dropped for a moment, thoughtful, then returned to Evan. Exactly. And sometimes, it makes you realize what's missing. Evan swallowed, feeling the words sink deep. It wasn't just Adrian noticing, it was the mirror of himself reflected back through someone else's understanding. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt seen without pretense. They talked quietly, deliberately. It was not the casual banter of acquaintances, nor the shallow conversation Michael seemed to prefer. It was slow, deliberate, and meaningful. They shared small confessions, fears, disappointments, unspoken regrets. Adrian spoke of past mistakes and emotional missteps, never revealing the exact details but hinting at experiences that made Evan feel a kindred understanding. I think sometimes we meet people at the wrong time, Adrian said softly, the words hanging in the cold air like fragile glass. Evan looked at him, sensing layers beneath the statement he couldn't yet articulate. Maybe, he whispered. Or maybe we don't realize the right time until it's gone. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden creak from the hallway. Evan stiffened, realizing it was Michael. He hadn't expected him to return so early. Adrian, sensing the shift, rose to his feet immediately, retreating slightly toward the bed. Evan felt a tight knot of tension in his chest as Michael entered, eyes narrowing when he noticed Adrian. What's going on here? Michael asked, voice a mixture of suspicion and irritation. Adrian met his gaze steadily. I couldn't sleep in the guest room. It's freezing. Evan offered me a place here. Just for the night. Michael's expression hardened, but he didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and loaded with unspoken accusations. Evan, for the first time, saw Michael in a different light, not just absent or distracted, but defensive, fragile, and human. I see, Michael finally said, though his voice was tight. He turned away, trying to regain composure. I suppose I should have fixed the heater. Evan felt a mix of relief and frustration. It wasn't Adrian's fault, but the confrontation had peeled back layers of avoidance between all three of them. Michael's secrecy, his tendency to avoid difficult conversations, had been a silent wedge in their relationship. And now, in this unexpected moment, it was exposed. Adrian, ever careful, spoke softly. It's all right. No one's at fault here. His eyes flicked to Evan, a subtle acknowledgement passing between them. Evan felt the weight of it, the quiet, unspoken understanding. Michael left the room abruptly, muttering about needing to cool off. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Evan and Adrian in a quiet stillness that felt charged and fragile. Evan realized that the night had stripped away pretenses, leaving raw honesty in its wake. He felt the responsibility of that honesty pressing against him, an awareness of emotions he could no longer ignore. They returned to their places, sitting across from one another on the bed. Evan noticed small things, the way Adrian's hands rested lightly on his knees, the way his gaze didn't flinch from direct contact, the subtle tension in his posture. It was not about physical desire, not yet, it was about presence, attention, acknowledgement. Why are you really here, Adrian? Evan asked finally, voice low, almost a whisper. Adrian paused, choosing his words carefully. I came as a friend. But sometimes, it's impossible to ignore the connections that appear, even when they shouldn't. Evan nodded, feeling the truth in those words resonate in his chest. He realized that Adrian's arrival had revealed more about himself, his marriage, and the emotional gaps he had been quietly tolerating than any conversation with Michael had in years. Hours passed in quiet discussion, reflection, and the rare intimacy of understanding without intrusion. Evan felt the weight of decisions he had been avoiding, the necessity of confronting feelings long ignored. By the time the first hints of dawn crept through the curtains, he had made a silent vow to himself: he would not continue to live in the shadows of his own emotions. The morning arrived with gentle sunlight filtering through the windows. Adrian, ever considerate, prepared to leave the room, glancing at Evan with a subtle mixture of gratitude and unspoken tension. "Tomorrow," Adrian said softly, "I'll be on my way. But tonight, I wanted to be honest. Not about everything, but about some things." Evan felt a lump in his throat. "I understand." Adrian smiled faintly. "Sometimes we meet the right person at the wrong time. And sometimes, we realize the truth about our own lives when they appear." Evan watched as Adrian left the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. The weight of his absence settled over the house, a poignant reminder of the fragile but undeniable connection that had formed. Evan knew the night had changed him irrevocably, even if no physical boundary had been crossed. That he returned to his room, sitting on the edge of the bed and staring at the ceiling. The moral complexity of the situation, the emotional intimacy, and the confrontation with truth lingered. Evan understood that life would no longer be simple. Michael's absence and emotional distance were clearer than ever, and Adrian's presence had been a mirror he could not unsee. By mid-morning, Evan resolved to face the inevitable. He would confront his feelings, examine the fractures in his marriage, and navigate the tension that Adrian had exposed, not through actions, but through honesty. The house, once a quiet stage for routine and polite avoidance, now held an unspoken promise: truth, vulnerability, and the inevitable reckoning that comes when someone finally sees you. Evan's heart felt heavy, yet strangely lighter. The night had ended, but its consequences had only just begun. He knew Adrian would leave, Michael would return, and the fragile equilibrium of the household would be tested. But Evan also knew that he had glimpsed a deeper honesty within himself, and that realization, quiet, profound, and unsettling, would guide the choices he made next. Sitting on the bed, Evan closed his eyes, the memory of Adrian's presence lingering like a soft echo. He understood the visit had been more than a courtesy, more than a fleeting disruption. It had been a catalyst, a mirror, and a challenge. And as he prepared to face the day, he felt the first stirrings of resolve, of clarity, and of courage to confront the truths he had long avoided. The house was quiet again, but Evan knew, deep down, that nothing would ever feel quite the same. The night had passed, but the impact would echo for days, weeks, perhaps even longer. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself: "He came as a guest, slept on my bed, and left me with a truth I could no longer ignore."